There we go. And I will just introduce our first speakers. So our first speakers for today are Mandy Hughes and Louise Whitaker, and they're speaking on the topic of engendering social inclusion through empowering practices. So over to you. Are you having issues unmuting? There we go.
Hello, I was having problems actually coming into the room, and I'm here. So thank you so much for your patience.
No worries. And do we have, oh, we've got Mandy here as well and Louise. Okay, great. And both of you are not on mute. Awesome. I think we're ready to go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natasha, and thanks everyone for your patience. My name's Mandy Hughes. I'm from Southern Cross University, and my research partner, Louise Whitaker, is also going to be presenting and taking over from me halfway through. I'd also like to acknowledge Barbara Rugendijk, our other research partner, and also Emma Aspden from Anglicare North Coast, who's also collaborated quite a lot with us on this research. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of contextual information. Louise, if you could go to the next slide, please, that would be lovely. Thank you. So the 3 E's to Freedom program was established by Anglicare North Coast in 2016. An initial pilot program ran in Coffs Harbour in northern New South Wales, and the aim of the program was really about supporting women to seek sustainable employment, so providing a range of different skills and experiences. After 12 months, the program expanded and included 2 additional sites, so Lismore in northern New South Wales and also the Gold Coast. And at the other sites, there were also women from a range of different migrant backgrounds, so other visa types as well, although at the Coff site, it was predominantly women from refugee backgrounds who participated. So the women learnt a whole range of different skills. They learnt to drive, they learnt to ride bikes, to swim. They also did some formal training, so food hygiene certificates, first aid certificates, IT skills, also enhancing English language skills. Some of the women were interested in going down fairly well-trodden paths, perhaps, for other members of their community. So perhaps they sought to go into aged care or childcare. But this was a really diverse group. And so, for example, one woman wanted to be a pilot, another wanted to join the police force, some wanted to start small businesses. So there was a really broad range of different aspirations. The program supported 142 women over the period it operated, so around a 5-year period. And these women came from 36 different countries, so a lot of cultural diversity there. Some women came from Afghanistan, Myanmar, Congo, Iraq, Syria, Indonesia, India, so quite a broad range, and there was variety depending on which location. Although the program was really set up to support the women to seek sustainable employment, we soon realised that the program was really about making social connections. It was really about enhancing a sense of belonging. And that was when the employment opportunities would come once that social, those connections were made. So as researchers, we've been involved in documenting and analysing the program. We've also supported staff reflections. We've been on the program steering committee. And throughout the work, we've really been interested in developing a strong regional community and university partnership. So that was the foundation of our approach. Next slide. Anglicare North Coast approached us to partner with them to document their program, and so action research, a collaborative action research approach, seemed to be the way forward. This made sense to us, so we did quite a lot of co-designing. We aimed also to be creative in terms of our research outputs, and so as well as having traditional academic outputs like papers, journal articles and reports, we also made films, we held art exhibitions, and we wrote a book. So we really wanted to make this research accessible. We wanted the community to be interested in what was happening in the program, and we wanted to build bridges to the community. So something that we were really aiming to do, excuse me, in the research was to capture the unique nature of this program. So it really was tailored to the diverse needs of the women, but also the area itself, so taking place in a specific regional location. And another way we were able to do that is because the 3 researchers were located in each of these different regional areas. So that gave us another level of understanding because the researchers were also part of the communities. Next slide. Although many of the women in the program had experienced trauma, the staff didn't want the women to necessarily retell these experiences. So the program was really about having fun and feeling safe. So safety was built into the program. This really allowed the women to make deep connections. So the staff were really interested in fostering these connections as much as possible within the group, but also across groups and to the broader community. So we've already heard from a number of presenters this morning about the importance of social capital, and that was something that was really embedded in the program. Staff also used their own social capital to strengthen bonds to the broader community. So staff drew on their own networks and they made warm referrals to connect women to the services and the support that they needed. So very much about looking at individual and diverse needs. Next slide. The program was also very much embedded in a place-based approach, and this was supported by staff. So the program was all about getting out and about and experiencing the local area. So not just talking about a nice place to visit, but actually going there, walking, talking together and experiencing new places and new local experiences. The program's successes were shared with local communities, as I mentioned, in a number of ways, and one of these included having the community art exhibitions. Louise will touch on this a little bit more later. But overall, the program aimed to provide unique and location-specific, but most importantly, individually tailored experiences for the diverse program participants. As I said, although many of the women might have had the shared experience of coming from a refugee background, they did, of course, come from different cultures and they had varied life experiences. A number of women came on women at risk visas, so a lot of women from Afghanistan, so they were women-headed households, whereas more recently we've had Yazidi settlement in Coffs Harbour and there've been larger families, so quite diverse needs. But acknowledging that these women have unique stories and that they don't have a singular identity really informed the success of the program. So I'll hand over to Louise.
Thanks, Mandy. So and I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Niagara country, so a little further north from Mandy. And so we've really interpreted when we thought about the idea of the single experience, that, you know, that this is beyond that, is to say that from this program, what we've realised is, yes, each of the women had their own unique experience and background and contribution that they brought with them, but also that beyond the individual identity is actually a community response, our experience as researchers as much as the staff who are working with them. So each of us actually brought something to the program, and the program made our lives richer, I think, for all of us. So the success that was realised, though, was because we recognised the uniqueness of the women, and also that the women were co-designing the program as it developed. So as women were talking from different countries, they were able to interpret the Australian culture to each other and give each other information as much as we could give them information about what might be happening within the community. So the program really, as you can hear from Mandy's description, built social capital. It really built the capacity of the community. It built the capacity of the service that the program was located in, and the various communities that were that the program worked within. So one of the things that we were conscious of is that we were thinking about this idea of being part of a group. Do you need to retell stories of trauma? And we were aware that, in fact, we wanted to really respect the privacy of the women, and for the women to be able to feel empowered to tell the story that they wanted to, and to create a new story in their lives as they moved into Australia and into communities. And so really it was up to the women to tell the stories that they felt they wanted to about their lives, and to start to think about how they would develop their lives from here and their roles in communities. I'm going to just flick to the next one, because one of the things that was an outcome of the program was a toolkit that I think really complements the work that Amin, I think his name was, earlier has developed. And so this process, part of what we did within the program was we actually stopped with staff and reflected with them about the processes that they'd used to foster this co-design process and to foster social inclusion and to build social capital. And we identified with them the kinds of work that was involved. And they shared with us that there were five key themes that emerged. The first one was actually about learning to listen deeply to one another, to really hear beyond, to give people the opportunity to speak as they would like to, and to really listen beyond cultural differences and with cultural differences. They talked about tailoring the program to the uniqueness of women, as you could hear from what Mandy was saying before. A really important feature of this was about managing the way that the organisation, this particular non-government organisation, managed the program to allow the experiences of the women to influence the program development, rather than putting pressure on the women to conform to what it is the program thought they should do. Instead, the program responded to what it was the women needed, if you like. Another important feature was this idea of finding a niche. And that was about about the fact that there are a number of organisations and supports, as we heard, Rotary clubs, community organisations that are working in this space. How do we set programs into a niche within a broader community of what's going on to complement the range of services? And finally, how do we collaborate together across sectors to actually build really sustainable, rich communities, socially inclusive communities in our regions? And so this toolkit that's been developed is something like a quality improvement toolkit. It's online. It's intended to be an opportunity for people to actually sit and reflect on the work that we're doing together, to see how we might continue to develop the work further to build rich communities. And one of these things that I was thinking earlier is that the question that Alison raised about what do we need to better understand, and I would think it is something about how do we work together collaboratively when there's an existing network of services that are there in regional communities. How do we think about working collaboratively across those? So this QI program, which is actually available via Anglicare North Coast's website, this is a link to the program, which it invites reflective practice. A final comment is, are you saying, Natasha, we're about to finish? Yeah, that's fine. A final comment is that there might be opportunities for this work to actually apply to other groups of people, but we'd really want to honour the fact that the women who've come from refugee and migrant backgrounds have shared this experience with us, and that this is actually quite a great opportunity to continue to develop socially inclusive communities with them.
Thank you.
Finish. I think it's 12 minutes. Yeah.
Yes. Did you hear the timer when it beeped?
I didn't.
Oh,
no.
you didn't? Oh,
so,
okay.
No.
Something must be going wrong with my timer. I might have to use my words instead. All right.
Thank you.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much, Louise and Mandy. And if I can ask you to just stop sharing your screen, and we'll invite John to start sharing his screen. And if you have any problems with that, let me know, John. And I will also make sure that you can unmute. You're unmuted. Good.
Great, thanks. Let me just share this. How's that?
It's waking up. So what I'll do, given that my beepy thing didn't work, I will at 1 minute to go, just quickly turn my mic on and say 1 minute to go. So apologies for the interruption.
No worries,
all right.
Just cut me off.
Okay, so we've got John Van Kooy, who's speaking about a paper titled Situated Welcome, the Local Inclusion and Settlement Experiences of Refugees in Australian Neighbourhoods. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everyone. My name's John Van Kooy. I'm a PhD student at Monash University. I've also worked in the, I guess, broadly the settlement sector for some time as a researcher, an applied researcher and evaluator. So I'm going to be talking a bit today about a set of findings from my PhD project, which is a mixed method study on the theme of refugee settlement in local neighbourhoods. I'm in the writing up stage now. And I'm very tired. Okay, so Australia has a large refugee intake by global standards, and we know that per capita we have a large intake. It's premised on humanitarian need, of course, but with that sort of generosity, I suppose, comes expectations. There's an expectation that all migrants, including refugees, will have the capacity to communicate in English, to be employed, actively participate in Australian society, embrace Australian values, etc., and have contact with the Australian community. So these are bullet points from the guidelines for a Department of Home Affairs grant program on fostering integration. So these sort of expectations, the way they're framed, are very much embedded in the, I guess, in the the machinery of government, reflected in our settlement service approaches. It's evident in the public discourse on refugees. It's not particularly controversial, I'd say, or at least not unusual globally. It's the kind of deal, I suppose, that most receiving countries offer resettled refugees. It's reflected in the Global Compact for Refugees. So this is sort of framing up the expectations. At the federal level, more specifically, we're interested in the 3 E's. It was interesting to hear about the 3 E's in the previous presentation. I'm not sure to what extent they align with the ones I'm talking about here, but the 3 E's in 5 years. That is Commonwealth Settlement Services prioritise employment, education and English within 5 years post-arrival. So that's the critical settlement period for refugees. There's obviously a lot more to the National Settlement Framework. We heard Alison this morning talk about a whole range of other domains, and service providers in particular are expected to deliver a whole range of supports across other areas. But the emphasis is very much on getting a job, learning English, and possibly being engaged in education as quickly as possible. So that's settlement in its kind of reductive form, if you like. So my PhD project is focused on unpacking this with respect to situated relationships between refugees and host communities. And that's because we know that there isn't a singular refugee experience post-arrival in Australia. Settlement experiences vary by location according to a range of factors. There's instrumental factors to do with, say, local labour market conditions, for example, but also social factors, the relationships between different ethnic groups, the nature of community welcome, prejudice, tolerance, opportunities for exchange and learning, all those sorts of things play into refugee experiences. So these opportunities and the resources that refugees have access to, they vary quite widely. We know that. So within capital cities, but also between cities and regional areas, and within and across regional destinations themselves. So that's the sort of background to my study. So my research questions: what is the significance of local social connections for refugee settlement outcomes? I look at an analysis of some panel survey data, which is a Building a New Life in Australia study, which was referenced earlier this morning. And how do the features of local neighbourhoods shape those experiences? So that's a qualitative case study in a regional setting. So just onto the quantitative study. So as I said, I used Building a New Life in Australia. It's a survey of refugees who were granted refugee status in 2013. And I look at the first 5 waves of that data. So I'm examining, on the left-hand side here, you can see these are my predictor variables. So how do refugees' levels of neighbourly interaction, cultural understanding, the sources of their friendships, the social support they have access to, and their levels of socioeconomic disadvantage in the neighbourhood, how do those 5 factors predict the 3 E's, employment, education, and English? I won't go into much more detail about the method. So I'm just going to zero in on a key set of findings. So this chart plots odds ratios from a logistic regression. So this is the odds of the BNLA survey participants, or the refugees in this sample, being in paid work by the 5th year of settlement in Australia, so year 5 of the survey. So what does this mean? So you'll see on the x-axis, an odds ratio greater than 1 indicates employment is more likely. So it's the left side of, let's see if I can point to this bit here, the left side of this line. And less than 1 means that they're less likely to be in employment. And on the y-axis, I've just plotted some of the demographics that are significant and the pre-arrival characteristics, and then my predictive variables. So what's this telling us? Essentially, remember that I'm interested in the significance of local social connections to settlement. The variable of interest here is at the bottom, it's sources of friends. So compared to people with mixed or multi-ethnic sources of friends, people with refugees who have only co-ethnic friends or no friends are much less likely to be in employment after 5 years. So in other words, holding all other factors constant in the sample of refugees that I'm working with in this model, those with mixed multi-ethnic friendships are much more likely to be in employment by the 5th year of settlement in Australia. And so recall that I wanted to look at the importance of other things as well, being able to speak to your neighbours, understanding Aussie culture, that sort of thing. None of those factors are significant in any of the models that I ran. So that includes for education and English. So it's really multi-ethnic friendships that were important for all of the 3 E's in the models that I developed. So let's see if I can get rid of this. Okay, so why should we care about interethnic friendships or multi-ethnic friendships? So they provide, obviously, potentially a useful resource, information, for example, about jobs. They offer emotional connectedness. So it helps to people to feel secure, to be accepted in a new society. This is really essential for refugees who've been forced to relocate and find their place in a new home. So in summary, it's multi-ethnic friendships can lead to greater emotional and material stability and security, as Foster and Hartley have argued. So thinking about the theme of this session, it's not a singular refugee experience. Some subgroups are also more likely to develop these friendships over time. It's refugees who are, by and large, in younger age groups. They arrive with higher levels of human capital, so pre-migration work experience or education and English. And it's people who settle in higher socioeconomic areas or areas that are more advantaged relative to others. So what's important is both the friendships, but also the composition of those kind of pre-arrival characteristics for developing friendships. So really quickly, just at the qualitative study that I'm also working on. So the quant part was about establishing some patterns at the national level. This is very much a general sort of survey that doesn't really allow for a regional lens. It can't really disaggregate too well. So hence, region town, and I'm anonymizing it because I'm still in the process of, socializing the findings with stakeholders, etc. So I won't go into the method or the details. You'll just have to trust me that I did some really good interviews in regional Australia. Basically, I looked at the impact of interethnic friendships and the nature of welcome on settlement experiences. So refugees that I spoke with showed, I guess, an appreciation or a recognition of everyday friendliness from other residents in this location. So amidst the language barriers, community welcome was equated with neighbourly greetings and offers of basic support, and even a sort of passive recognition of refugees in the area, or basically the absence of any obvious hostility, was linked by some participants to the concept of welcome. There's a couple of examples here of just basic kind of interaction, neighbourly interaction. But in contrast, there was also fairly significant kind of episodic verbal and physical harassment actually towards refugees in otherwise sort of everyday settings like the residential street or shopping centres, that sort of thing. And these experiences, these negative experiences, triggered feelings of rejection for my participants, backgrounded by their sort of forced migration experiences. There were negative experiences that left people really questioning whether they'd be accepted into Australian society and Australian culture, and a lack of respect, I think, was one of the other quotes here. Yeah, you know, they don't love us, they don't care what we say, they don't respect us. So that really being made to feel like an outsider by way of these negative encounters with people in the community. And sort of linking back to the findings of the first study, so some participants did recognise the critical value of social connections, having access to, this gentleman's talking about having access to someone who's trained in the system to help people become culturally oriented to, you know, what you should do and what you should not do. So that sense of the importance of interethnic social bridges was recognised by several participants in the interviews. So just kind of wrapping these things up together, I started off this presentation by talking about the institutional expectations of refugees, so the 3 years and 5 years. This is still a big part of informing this kind of continuous re-emergence of the regional policy agenda for refugee settlement. The assumption, I think, in a lot of cases is that there is a good fit or potentially a good fit between refugees and regional areas because of the drive to settle, to work and to integrate. But I guess what I'm saying here is that the material and the emotional go hand in hand. And to summarize, you know, social connections, multi-ethnic friendships are critical assets for refugees. Without it, they're not likely to fare as well in those key outcome areas of the 3 E's. But the ability to forge those connections doesn't sit with refugees alone. Of course, it requires a welcoming disposition and attitudes from the host community. And more than that, I think a set of intercultural skills, really, right down to the neighbourhood level. And that's not usually where we focus our efforts around welcome. It's often kind of more at the city level, policy-wise. So those day-to-day encounters in the neighbourhood. Yep.
Sorry, 1 minute to go.
Okay. Yeah, so those day-to-day encounters in the neighbourhood, I think, shape refugee experiences of inclusion or exclusion. Yeah, and I might leave it there, actually. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you, John. That was well within time. Thank you, and sorry for the interruption. All right, I look forward to chatting more about that in the discussion time at the end of the session. If I could ask you to please stop sharing your screen, and then we will try to have the next group share their screen. So Carol and Jock, I'm not sure which one of you will be sharing your screen, but if we could try to make that happen, and if you need my help, let me know. All right, we seem to be sharing just fine. And please let me know if you have any issues unmuting yourself.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm
Hello.
just starting my clock for 6 minutes so that I don't go over Carol's time.
That's very kind of you to split it into your share and hers. All right,
so I just wanted to thank the organisers of this important conference and pay my respects to the Gadigal on whose land we sit. So what we're doing is reporting on the findings of our Australian Research Linkage Project. It's basically a 3-year study. Really looked at the impact and the experiences of the Syrian conflict cohort that arrived, but also using Afghan refugees as a control group. You can see there that basically we started off looking at 248 families and did surveys. So we had 699 surveys. So it's quantitative and qualitative methodology across the 3 states with the major service providers as our industry partners. In many ways, I think this is probably the largest, most contemporary bit of research on recent refugee arrivals, and we wanted to give you a flavour of some of that information. Of course, it's very rich, complex. We've finished the field work analysing the data. You can just see there from that particular screen the different areas where we, in the metropolitan and regional areas where we conducted our field work. What we have there, and you'll find that a very dense table, and I don't expect really that we can sort of explore that, but I wanted to use it in order to demonstrate first on the left-hand side the sorts of questions we asked about social experiences and social connection, about children feeling safe, about English language, about employment, and about happiness with life overall. And you can see here that we've got these first sets of results over 1, 2 and 3 years for the metropolitan, 1, 2 and 3 years for the regional areas. In this very last chart, we can see what the changes we'd hypothesised that there'd be a very positive overall experience, and we can see that particularly with respect to employment. Basically, if you look at the employment area, we can see here that in each year the metropolitan and regional employment outcomes, first of all, employment had gone up. So that was a very important outcome of our work. Not so much in the regional areas, but sort of in all areas they'd gone up. When we look at the gender dimensions of this, one of the questions was, have you found it hard getting a job? And John mentioned the BNLA, and what we did is we chose a lot of our sort of quantitative questions from the BNLA so we could compare our outcomes with that of the longitudinal survey. And you can see here that there's not a lot of difference in terms of gender in respect to the difficulty of getting a job. Note also how over the 3 rounds, the number of people in our survey decreased. That's normal, of course, in longitudinal work. One of the questions we asked, which is, if you like, an overall catch-all sort of question about how happy are you with your current life in Australia? And you can see there are a couple of things. First of all, that the blue, which is mostly to very happy, increased from years 1 to year 2 to year 3. And indeed in year 3, or round 3, which was really this year and last year, sort of the majority were mostly all very happy. A slight difference in metropolitan and regional, but probably not statistically different and statistically significant. So that's really a good outcome in terms of all things being considered. How do you feel? Now, I just want to sort of spend my last 2 minutes on some key insights. The first is the super diversity of refugees settling in regional Australia. A number of the previous presenters, Mandy and Louise and John, mentioned this, but great differences in language, background, language spoken at home, ethnicity, religion, social class, educational attainment, English fluency. So that, and I don't need to tell this audience, that there's terrific diversity in this group we called recently arrived refugees. Gender and work in regional Australia, there are differences. A lot of women have found work for the first time in Australia, whereas in maybe Syria, Iraq or Afghanistan, they did not work. This has had some implications for gender relations in the home. We visited their homes for the first 2 years and by Zoom in the third. And gender relations have been challenged somewhat by women getting jobs and men not having employment. Basically, we know that all these families are displaced. That's the very nature of refugee settlement, but they're connected virtually. In the homes we went to, they had this sort of their mobile phone, connected with. The critical issue, of course, is they move here, they undertake the great risk and challenges in order to secure a better life for their children in the future. And that's a good way to segue to Carol.
Okay, thanks, Jock. I'm muted. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So thanks, Jock. I've not chosen to do all of the quantitative data we have because it's quite extensive. But I'm just letting you know that we had, out of that surveys that were done and the families, 198 young people aged between 5 and 18 years of age. This is the rough age distribution, and you can see that between 10 and 14 was the dominant age. We picked up people over 18 due to the iPad being passed around outside of our vision and picking up a few people who were the wrong age. We sorted that out in our analysis. We chose the age range because we were interested in the range of experiences that weren't defined by any particular notion of childhood. There's this kind of false split between the notion of children and youth, whereas we found some 5 and 6-year-olds were incredibly talkative and insightful, and some 17-year-olds the reverse. So it's very important to understand that the new sociology looks at that cohort in much more complex ways and sees they have much more agency than more traditional approaches. So some of these young people were amazing. Very briefly, this is mainly showing you that they're fairly happy this is the first year. By the third year, 100% of young people in Queensland in regional areas were happy with their education. But generally across 3 states, it was between 80 and 90% were happy. You can see the split there of the number of people between regional and metropolitan areas. So a bit less in regional areas, but enough to give us a sense that they were very happy in that space. So education-wise, schools responded really well. Bit of an issue with TAFE for those who were older in this young people cohort, in the sense that in regional areas, just due to sheer numbers, in places like Coffs, for example, where people who weren't accepted in school because they were just the wrong age and were sent to TAFE, found themselves in classes with much older people and dropped out. So if people are going to be targeted for regional areas, we need to be very careful at looking at that NEET category, the not in employment, education or training. And these are particularly people who have either not had much schooling or not fitted into any senior colleges if particular states don't have them. We have a rule that says if you start TAFE, you can't then go back to these senior colleges. So there's all sorts of rigid guidelines around how to deal with that particular cohort. These very important place-based elements for families, and bear in mind our study was around families, which is why we're talking about adults and young people. So the whole problem of refugee being a category we're trying to deconstruct here, we also need to deconstruct further and see that it's families and they're made of young people. So employment doesn't just drive where people live. It's also factors that considering the young people's education. So access to universities in regional areas becomes something for many aspirational families. So context is really important. We know that Yazidi are happier in smaller places and community is very central to their existence. That was less so with Syrians, for example, much happier to move around. That depends on age as well. So older refugees wanted to be with their community. Younger ones wanted to be able to advance their lives in different ways. One key issue for regional areas is this examples in some regional centres we went to where there was fighting on the streets between local First Nations males, teenagers and Afghan males. But in another place, in another space, a school principal realised that an arrival of a very large cohort of Yazidi was going to unsettle her predominantly Indigenous school population. So she brought elders in, and the elders basically help manage that kind of process of arrival. So regional areas is where that interface is going to be felt more often. Community hubs, refugee support leaders that were in New South Wales, critical to providing access to cultural knowledge for families, because families will go to schools, they will go to sites where their children are, and schools are often these rigid separate systems, I understand that. But working with schools is one way to get that cultural knowledge going.
Carol, excuse
yes?
me, just a minute to go.
1 minute to go.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I'll just say that the whole issue that everyone's talking about, young people want to meet other young people outside of formal situations, outside of this whole kind of formalised school, church, sport. They talk about that often. The young people have this kind of identities. Let me just get to identities. In one family, you will have young people expressing diverse identities. You'll have young people saying, I'll always be Afghan, or I'm an Aussie now. Or at home, I feel Afghan, at school, I feel Aussie. But most want citizenship, Jock had mentioned that, and most feel like they belong, at least partially in one way or another. So there's a lot more, but that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol and Jock. And just across those first three presentations, that importance of social connection is really coming through as a very consistent theme. So thank you for that presentation. And Sonia, I can see you're starting to share your screen, which is fantastic. So our final speaker is Sonia de Mezza from the Loddon Campaspe Multicultural Services. So I will hand over to you, Sonia. And once again, please do forgive me when I do my 11-minute interruption. It always feels terribly rude.
Sure.
And,
can you see me?
No, I can't see you.
Oh, sorry. Can you see me now and hear me?
Now I can see you and I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
All right, over to you.
Thank you. Really nice to be here today. My name is Sonia de Mezza. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Loddon Campaspe Multicultural Services, also known as LCMS. Today, I just want to talk a little bit about our refugee communities in the Bendigo, Loddon Campaspe region, just to share some observations and how we're supporting our refugee communities to settle in this area. I go to the next one. Hang on. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet today, the Dja and all the other lands upon which you're all meeting, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So a little bit about our organisation. Loddon Campaspe Multicultural Services is the peak body for the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria, run by and for multicultural communities. We're an NGO, we empower people from migrant and refugee backgrounds to participate fully in Australian society, speak a number of languages. So let me tell you a little bit about Bendigo. As someone who's only been here in Victoria for the last 10 months, I originate from Sydney. I found the history and the demographics of Bendigo to be very fascinating. In the 1850s, we know there were a number of Chinese migrants that came in the gold rush era. And within 10 years, 20% of the population at that time were of Chinese origin. Multiculturalism, but over the next couple of 100 years, there have been, scatterings of different migrant communities. But it was only very recently that refugee communities came to Bendigo. So we have three main communities that live here or that have chosen to Bendigo as their home. The Karen community, who are coming from the Thai-Burmese border. The South Sudanese who have come here as a result of the conflict in South or North Sudan, and which resulted in the independence of South Sudan. And also the Afghan HAZARA population who faced persecution by the Taliban in Afghanistan over a number of years for being an ethnic minority. If you look at the demographics of Australia in general, we have almost 30% by the last count of the ABS of Australians were born overseas, and 49% of Australians have one parent born overseas. However, in Bendigo, it's only 8.6%, according to ABS 2016. So we're just waiting for the most recent stats, really looking forward to that coming in the new year. Our top three languages are Karen, Mandarin, and Filipino Tagalog. But in the Loddon Campaspe region, it's Karen, Italian, and Mandarin. So a little bit about the Karen population. around 2007, two women, Sarah Taquinho and her mum, Dr. Mary Holland, travelled to the Burmese-Thai border, where they met with a number of Karen families, and they started to support and sponsor families to come to Bendigo. And from that first family, we have a number of families came. From the first family, one of the staff members actually works for LCMS to this day. And this is our largest refugee community in the region. And people in Bendigo have embraced the new community. So that's the community at one of our festivals that we've supported them with. It was really interesting. Emmanuel previously mentioned the situation in Neil, which is not in the Loddon Campaspe region, it's in Western Victoria. But Neil was a small country town, like many country towns in Australia, that was really suffering, and some people describe it as a dying town. But the Karen were persuaded to come to work in the Lover Duck factory, which is one of the largest producers of duck meat in Australia. And they came and they worked really hard and made their contribution and integrated really well on a number of levels into the Neil community. If you want to learn more about it, Australian Story has featured this wonderful story. So that's a good example of how the communities have really supported regional Victoria. Then we have the South Sudanese. This was a secondary landing point for the South Sudanese here in Bendigo. Many originated from Sydney and Melbourne, and in 2009 started coming to Bendigo. And one of the synergies was from some of the South Sudanese I've spoken to, they were very much attracted to the sense of community belonging that is found in this region, particularly in country towns. The South Sudanese have shown themselves to be very creative with their dancing, singing and cooking. They started doing a lot of work in process factory work at Don Kayar, salami processing, very entrepreneurial community. For example, one South Sudanese woman set herself up as a contractor for fellow workers to Swan Hill to pick fruit. So that's another community. And the third main community are the Afghan HAZARA. They came around 2014. As I previously mentioned, they were a persecuted ethnic minority group from Afghanistan facing persecution from the Taliban. And this was a more agrarian population, because similar to the country communities that you will find in parts of Pakistan where the Afghan HAZARA have settled, and in Afghanistan itself. Many were professional builders and tilers, but unfortunately those qualifications were not recognised here in Australia. Many worked in factories, fruit picking and farming, and they picked up skills. And so we have a number of programs of LCMS, one of which is our employment program for migrant and refugee communities. And when you work with the communities, it is not enough to just find a job and just plonk anyone into that job. A lot more work is needed working in this space. LCMS adopts a very integrated approach to employment. We need to focus on understanding where people from our communities want to work, where they're matching their interests and skills with the jobs that are available. It is an ongoing process. We provide cultural support so that people can understand what the job and training requirements are. And we have staff who provide bilingual support, which is really fundamental and necessary. So we work with our employers, not just the communities, but also the employers who are very interested to learn about the refugee communities that they support. So we provide for training for employers, cultural competency training, and we work with them with onboarding training for job seekers. So there might be many different things that people who are seeking jobs don't understand about: policies, procedures, WHS systems, and we really help them to understand. So in regional areas, it's difficult to find people in certain sectors, such as factory processing work, fruit picking work. We have seen in the pandemic that a lot of the fruit has gone rotting on the trees, and the refugee communities really have played a part to help in that work. So it's very much about adopting a community person-centered approach and a strengths-based approach. So we like to focus to understand where the people from our communities come from, matching the interests and skills with jobs, providing that ongoing cultural support. So a bit more specifics about communities. In Greater Bendigo, we have 3,000 Karen households, but those stats might change. 200 Afghan HAZARA households, including single men, and 50 Dinka households from refugee communities, just to give you a bit of background. So we don't just help refugee communities, also migrants from the wider community. And we also provide a number of other services, which is so important when we're working with these communities, not just about employment, education, English training, social activities, so that people can feel that they belong. So here's a number of, I've just realised we're kind of running out of time, but a number of different sectors and organisations where we have helped place people into employment. We here in Bendigo have faced our fair share of challenges. You may recall in 2014, there was conflict over the building of a mosque. This is a place where I've never seen so many Catholic churches. There are a lot of places to worship, but this was an area of contention, perhaps because of misunderstandings. So there were protests, which was taken all the way to the High Court. The Bendigo Mosque is in the process of being built. So there are challenges when you come to the regional areas. And some of the challenges on an individual basis that we've seen, people who have had their secondary education or their education, including literacy, interrupted as a result of conflict that's happening in their country of origin, where formal education is not recognised here in Australia, low English language proficiency, low literacy, digital literacy, we'll see that in some of our older job seekers, lack of knowledge on job search techniques, and personal circumstances that really can hold people down, including low confidence and self-esteem. So these are some of the challenges that we are aware of and that we work with our people to help overcome. But we know that work is very much a key to creating that sense and fostering that sense of belonging. It provides the income that people need to live with dignity as participating and contributing members of society. It helps people to get a good accommodation and helps young people to participate with their school peers if there's a steady income. So a really, really interesting demographic here in Bendigo. Lots of challenges, but we really feel that we're on our way to helping our refugee communities to feel like they belong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Sonia. That was within time, so thank you.
Okay.
Very well done. My alarm didn't even go off.
Okay.
And so great to hear from a practitioner perspective as well, not just an academic one. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Great,
so
thank you.
What I will do quickly now is I'll stop the recording so that we can have the Q&A.